Hi, and welcome back to Small Caps. My name is Jess Fertig. I'm your host, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome James McDonnell, who is the CEO of Prescient Therapeutics Limited. The ASX ticker code is PTX. Hi, James. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Jess. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So, James, you've just joined as the CEO earlier this year, end of January, and your board has had quite a few changes. So I thought, as a start, would you mind providing us a brief overview of the company, and also a bit of a background on your experience and that of your board as well?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. Prescient is a clinical stage oncology company. We have a targeted therapy and assets in the cell therapy platform side. But our biggest focus at the moment is PTX 100, which is a targeted therapy, a RAS disruptor, if you like, a RAS pathway disruptor, and very helpful in oncology. And we're putting that through a phase 2 study at the moment. In terms of my experience, yes, I've recently arrived just in late January. I come from more of a commercial land. I've been in biotech and pharma, global roles, as well as in ASX roles, Chemgenics, etc. I'm quite excited. It's not often you get an opportunity to work with a phase 2 asset such as PTX 100 that's really showing some great results in phase 1 and the reason why we're into phase 2. In terms of our board, there has been change there. So Dr. James Campbell was now the chair of the board, and he's Australian-based, and we've also added Melanie Farris, who's strong on the governance side. So what we're doing is really creating the right people in the role from a governance perspective and a leadership perspective, because that really helps my role to drive performance within the company and really get the phase 2A PTX 100 study moving and getting in the right direction.
Fantastic, James. And now you mentioned the phase 2 that you're in with PTX 100. What are the next sort of key milestones for PTX 100, and how close are you getting it to market?
Yes, well, PTX 100 is as I mentioned earlier, it inhibits a particular enzyme which disrupts the RAS pathway. And in oncology, that's really important. And 22% of cancers are impacted by the RAS pathway. And at the moment, we're really targeting on cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, because what we saw in our phase 1 results in T-cell lymphoma is that we compared very favorably against other therapies out there. In terms of response rates, we would expect to see around 30%. We saw a 45% response rate. And in terms of clinical benefit rate, our benchmark would be around 45%. We saw 64%. So 64% of these patients are actually in a progressive disease environment, are experiencing stable disease or better. So that's really important. And something I often talk about, which I didn't think I'd really end up talking about, but is serious adverse events. And in treatments for CTCL and TCL, we often get serious adverse events associated with the actual treatment. And so patients who are already fragile are experiencing, serious adverse events. With PTX 100, we saw only a 4% adverse event rate, serious adverse event rate in that study. And so we're providing a new treatment option without really impacting the fragility of the patient. So PTX 100 is stacking up very nicely. And so in our phase 2A, we received FDA designation for a fast track. So the FDA recognized that it's a clear unmet need and they would like to expedite the process for PTX 100 to market. And so that means we're allowed to communicate much more with the FDA. It means that in our phase 2A, we'll get to a certain point where we can define dosing, efficacy and safety, and we'll be discussing whether we can move that 2A into a 2B registration pathway. And if that's the case, then the pathway to approval and registration and availability of patients is much shorter. So yeah, it's on an expedited pathway, so that's really encouraging.
So fantastic. And James, I'll have a couple of questions about that just now. But first of all, how does PTX 100 compare to other CTCL treatments that are available out there in terms of results and safety?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I've mentioned in terms of that safety components. For instance, Lymphare is an FDA registered product. recently approved. It had a 36% serious adverse event rate attached to it in that approval. So when you think of 4% from our phase 1B, that compares very favourably. The other thing about Lymphare is that it was approved with a 36% response rate in CTCL, and we have in our study we're showing 45% in TCL. So even a tougher patient pool, we're showing a better response rate. So we've moved to our phase 2 study into a CTCL study because we feel that the patients are more available, and we're more likely to show response because that's what we saw more response of in our phase 1B, and therefore we'll be able to run a study which is shorter and faster. Well, shorter
Yeah.
and expensive, if you like.
So interesting. And obviously, having that FDA fast track really validates the product as well.
Yeah.
And in terms of that, what advantage does that FDA fast track and orphan drug status give you in terms of timing and market access, do you think?
Yeah, well, those are quite critical, particularly in CTCL, which is an orphan drug disease. And so the orphan designation means that when we get to market, we have a 7 years exclusivity period where we can commercialize the product in an exclusive environment. But to get there, we also have the fast track designation, and the FDA set up these fast track designations for drugs that they recognize have good early phase results. And they also understand that the patients have a clear unmet need of finding new therapies for their disease state. And so CTCL fits perfectly in that realm. And so when we were designated a fast track designation, that means we have an expedited pathway. So the FDA will work with us to enable us to get PTX 100 through the various hurdles and pathways as soon as that we possibly can and out to market. So, and that means we have a phase 2A study which has 2 dose limits that we're trying to optimize the dose, and we're looking at some interim data after 20 patients. Now, if after 20 patients we receive some really good efficacy data, we'll discuss with the FDA whether we continue with that 2A or we actually switch to a 2B, and 2B registrational potential is there. And so those are the things that really shorten the development time period down. And I mean, development takes time. It's years, not days. But yeah, I mean, having an expedited pathway means that we're really shortening it as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely, James. And how big is the opportunity in CTCL? We know that it's a $1.8 billion market. How much of that could, PTX 100 capture, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, that's a $1.8 billion market for T-cell lymphomas in 8 major markets. And so not only will we capture some of the CTCL patients, we'll also capture some of the PTCL patients. And so when I look at examples, for instance, of drugs in the space already, mogamulizumab, last year in the US had estimated sales of over 220 million US dollars just in the US alone. And so it's hard to speculate exactly what that might be, but there's an example of what's happening currently, let alone in 2030.
And beyond CTCL, what other cancers could PTX 100 potentially treat? And when do you think we could start to see trials in that, if any?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, if you're disrupting the RAS pathway and RAS is involved in 22% of all cancers, you start thinking, well, which cancers are more RAS sensitive than others? And so that's what we'll be looking at. And RAS has been a target for investigators for quite some time. And we know we have a particular pathway that we interfere with. And so what does that mean in RAS sensitive tumours? So we will be working both to develop our commercial scope in that space, but also our medical and response scope in various tumours. And I would say we'd look at lung, colon, pancreas, biliary cell. There's a number that we'll look at, and that will create an opportunity for us to progress PTX 100 further. And that means, how soon that'll get to clinic. Well, it'll mean whether we take it ourselves or whether we actually do a commercial deal with another company that drives it through. So what it does is it creates opportunity to get something going.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I mean, it's an even bigger market that you could potentially capture.
Well,
Um,
yeah, that's it. After a lot of those markets are much bigger than orphan designation, and so that's why we need to tidy up our commercial side of it as well. Um, but but yeah, once you're impacting those disease areas, it's really significant. And the other thing there is, and quirkily, when I talk about serious adverse event rate, it is a lot of those tumors already have therapies, but if you can combine another therapy, you actually can attack an active tumor microenvironment with more than one arm, if you're more than one attack arm, if you like. And so if you're adding a therapy which is offering a different treatment approach, but without adding serious adverse events, it really makes it comfortable from a combination perspective.
so interesting, James. Now, you mentioned commercialization. So, what is the company's current funding position, and how are you planning to finance this next stage of development?
Well, we have cash to get us through various milestones of the phase 2A, but we need to get further than that. We need to get through the 2B, and that creates opportunity. So we're continuing to look at our cash position and our capital. We are reviewing it, but what I can say is that with the milestones that we have in the phase 2A, if at the interim data level we have some really solid data, that opens up opportunity in terms of, do we do things ourselves? Do we look at partnering? Do we look at licensing? Is it an M&A deal? It's about the opportunity at that point. So there's different ways of funding the progress of PTX 100, and the more milestone events that we have that can really solidify the potential of PTX 100, the more opportunity we get. So it's a roundabout way of saying, we'll need more funds, but how we get that is a little bit up in the air.
And this is sort of a random question, James, but does the government fund any sort of like R&D in this space? Is there any sort of potential for that kind of funding outside of strategics?
Yeah, the government do provide R&D tax incentives, so and so we certainly utilise that tax incentive, and that's important. So we have study sites in Australia. We have an international study because CTCL is an orphan disease, but we certainly look at maximising the R&D tax opportunity. So that, the government do provide support. They do it in a tax method as opposed to actually doing the research themselves. And we also work with institutions that are funded by the government and to help things along the way. But the R&D tax incentive is a real benefit for companies such as for Prescient. Mm.
Yeah, and a non-dilutionary sort of pathway as
Yeah,
well to
yeah,
keep
yeah, absolutely
relate.
non-dilutionary. And when you're really running a significant phase 2 study, your costs do go up. But when you can work with an R&D tax incentive, it reduces the burden.
So interesting, James. Now, before we finish, James, I have one final question for you. It's such an interesting discussion and an amazing product that you are developing at the moment. Just providing us with 2 to 3 key, takeaways or investment highlights as to why investors should have Prescient on their stock watch list.
Yeah, well, the first one is that PTX 100 is in phase 2A and moving it towards ever closer towards commercialization. And we have designations from the FDA that will allow us to expedite that process. And we have I guess, a technology, a RAS pathway disruptor that opens up opportunities for other cancer types. So pretty impressive story. It's a nearer term opportunity. We're not in preclinical, we're not in early phase 1B, we're actually on the road in phase 2, heading towards potentially a phase 2B registration study. So some very, very near term opportunity.
Yeah, and funded, and obviously validation with a fast-tracked
Yeah.
FDA pathway, which is very exciting. Um, Fantastic, James. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's really wonderful to meet you and to have you on the show, and look forward to watching how the company goes in its next stage of development, and having you back on the show to chat with us and update us on what's happening.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can do that because we've got, as I said, there's some interim data and things like that. There'll be some clear milestone events that are coming that'll really change the picture.
Wonderful. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Jess.